hit a button on your screen to move that text box. I really do appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rhett Burden. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging here at Compass Family Services in San Francisco, California. So excited to welcome you all into this virtual space as we honor Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian Heritage Month with our featured speaker, Cynthia Owyoung. Again, today's session is being recorded. You will be able to find this recording on the Compass Family Services YouTube page. That's right. Follow us on YouTube at Compass Family Services and on Eventbrite at Compass Family Services if you want to see other events that are coming up each and every month. I'm so excited to welcome and introduce our amazing speaker, Cynthia Owyoung. Cynthia is the author of All Are Welcome, How to Build a Real Workplace Culture of Inclusion That Delivers Results, a playbook for driving progress in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging inside organizations. She has established and led DEIB initiatives for 20 years as an executive at organizations across tech, media, and financial services, including Robinhood, Charles Schwab, and Yahoo. In addition, Cindy founded Breaking Glass Forums, a boutique agency developing strategies to accelerate diverse leadership and inclusive organizations. Entrepreneur Magazine recognized Cynthia on their 100 Women of Impact list in 2021. Prior to her work in human resources, Cindy built a decade-long career as a brand strategist for leading global brands and advertising agencies, developing campaigns for companies like Microsoft, Levi Strauss, and Apple. She currently serves on the board of directors for Ability Path, a nonprofit dedicated to empowering people with special needs to achieve their full potential. She has earned her MBA in organizational behavior from UCLA's Anderson School of Management, in addition to her bachelor degrees in marketing, finance, and psychology from UC Berkeley. Everyone, I'm so excited to welcome you to our Inclusion Talk series for May and introduce our speaker, Cynthia Owyoung. Cindy.
Thank you so much, Rhett, for inviting me to be talking to you all today. I am so thrilled to be honoring Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian Heritage Month. And so if you will bear with me, I have a few slides that, oops, this is not the correct. Hang on. Let's get the right slides here. Rhett, can you tell me if you're seeing the correct slides?
It says you have started sharing your screen, but the screen is black screen, so no slides.
Okay, how? I don't, let's see, let's try a new share. This was working a second ago, y'all. So if you will bear with me, let's see if I can get this working again.
The joys of technology.
You gotta love it.
Got it.
There we go. Got it.
All right. Appreciate your patience with the technological glitch there, but we are running and this is great. So I've got 3 key areas that Rhett asked me to cover in my brief talk today. I'll cover a little bit more about me. Rhett, thank you for the wonderful introduction. We'll go into a little bit more depth in terms of my career as an AAPI professional. Then we'll talk a little bit about AAPI Heritage Month, what it means, why it's important. And then I'll share with you a little bit about my book, All Are Welcome, and how you all can play a role in helping to make progress on diversity, equity, and inclusion inside whatever organizations you may be a part of. And we will save some time at the end for some open Q&A, where you can ask whatever comes up for you during this conversation or whatever is top of mind for you. Feel free to put it into the chat, and we will go back to that at the end of before the end of the hour. Okay. So let's see about me. So I thought it might be helpful for you all to kind of hear more about my career through what I like to use this pathway called a journey line. And you can see this sort of horizontal line here where it's really sort of the vertical axis is sort of a positive, broken into a positive and negative sentiment. And that's broken up by that dotted line across the screen. And this is the horizontal axis is really over time. So I was actually born and raised here in San Francisco. My parents are immigrants from China, however, so I'm ethnically Chinese, and I identify as an American-born Chinese, or what's often used as an acronym called ABC. Growing up in the Bay Area, I was fortunate enough to go to UC Berkeley for my undergrad. And I loved it there. I had, one of the best times there, just learning and growing into the individual that I am. And I decided to go into an advertising career. So I actually moved away from home to live in Los Angeles, which was my first time away from the Bay Area, to work at an ad agency called BBDO. And the reason why it's a little bit negative there was because when I told my parents I was going to move away, they said that they would not support me in that. Because they really did not want me moving away from the family. And I would have been I was the first person in my family to do that. So it was a huge deal for my parents, who were very traditional in their thinking about keeping the family together. Right. So that was hard. It was really hard for me to do, despite their disapproval. But I felt it was super important for me because I wanted to really jumpstart my career in the advertising world. I stayed there for a few years before moving back to San Francisco to work for another ad agency called Foote Konen Building. And in the course of all of that, I was able to repair the relationship with my parents, which was really, really important to me. Family is incredibly important to me, not just from a cultural perspective, but just, personally. And ended up staying only a couple of years back home before I went back to LA, where I attended UCLA for my graduate degree. Another really great experience that helped me actually crystallize the career direction I wanted to take from that point on. So when I was in grad school, I actually, I have a brother who is developmentally disabled, and he lost his job during the first tech bust about 20 years ago. And I had to find him a new job, and it was a really, really difficult and challenging endeavor. And so through that experience, I actually resolved that I wanted to go into companies and start my DEI career, because I wanted to go into companies to help open doors for people like my brother and others who may come from, experiences, backgrounds, cultures, where they didn't have the same advantages as other folks in the majority. So that's where I landed when I decided to go into a DEI career, landed at Intuit back in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I ping-ponged a little up and down the state. And just haven't looked back from that perspective, and have focused on DEI ever since. So I was fortunate enough to be part of the founding DEI strategy team at Intuit. did the same thing at Yahoo on a more global scale. Was at Yahoo for quite a number of years, which is why it's both old logo and newer logo, and both positive and then a little bit below that line because we went through so much turmoil in the time that I was there. But I really grew into my leadership as an Asian American professional while I was at Yahoo, where I think, earlier in my career, I really was I really felt some of those stereotypes around being Asian, being quiet, being a woman, and seen as very sort of like not of this country. All of that I definitely felt in my earlier career, but when I was at Yahoo, I started to really come into my own and learn how to be more of who I am, which is giving myself voice, giving myself agency, understanding how I could contribute as a decision maker, and sort of elevating the work that I did from being an individual contributor to being a people leader and a director at those companies. So did that really at Yahoo, went to a startup. The startup was not the best experience for me before I decided to go out on my own and start my company called Breaking Glass Forums. In doing that, I really enjoyed it, but I also discovered I don't do business development very well. So I decided to go back into corporate, where I landed at Charles Schwab in my first executive level role as a vice president, which was just a wonderful experience for me, being able to build a team and be at a company as well known and as impactful from a financial services perspective as Charles Schwab. Went to another startup when I decided to leave to go to Robinhood, which was great for a little while. And then with the economic downturn of 2022, it really impacted their business as well. So I decided to leave. And now I'm currently leading diversity, equity, and inclusion here at a company called Bill, which, if you're not familiar with it, does financial automation services for small and mid-sized businesses. So I'm thrilled to be here now. It's a company that has deep commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I've just started, so I'm looking forward to where this journey continues to take me in my career. But this is where I really feel like, particularly as an Asian American professional, there are not as many of us as you would expect there to be in positions of leadership at companies, particularly here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so that is also something that I'm working to change from the inside out. So that's a little bit about my career journey. I think what I'd also love to share with you is just a picture of my family. They are the drivers, the key motivators behind why I do what I do. I mentioned to you my one brother who is developmentally disabled. You can see him standing in the middle of this photograph next to my mom and my dad, who recently passed. But I also have another brother who is gay, and he's the one that I'm standing next to. And I'm the proud mother of two young boys, married to the wonderful person on the far right of this screen. We're in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor because my father also served in the Air Force when he was younger. So what I like to tell people is, I care about DEI from a lot of different dimensions of diversity because they were all present in my immediate family. And growing up, that gave me a really strong sense of empathy for other lived experience and a strong sense of social justice and needing to drive for that. So that is why I do what I do and why I've been doing what I've been doing for the past 20 years. So how does this relate to Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian Heritage Month? First, I think it's really important to talk about what it means to be Asian and Pacific Islander. That we are not a monolithic community. It's a community of over 17 million people across nearly 50 different races and ethnicities and countries and cultures. And while there are some commonalities across many of the cultures within the Asian diaspora, there's also just as many differences. And so it's important to recognize that we are not, while we are united across many aspects of our community, there are still individualistic differences across what it means to be Asian and Pacific Islander. And I just want to recognize that. But why is there an AAPI month? It's a month where we are able to really celebrate the achievements and contributions of Asians and Pacific Islanders in the United States. But did you know that May was chosen specifically to commemorate the immigration of the first Japanese immigrants to the United States on May 7th of 1843? And it also marks the anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad completion back in 1869, which was built by mostly Chinese immigrants at the time. So that is why May has special significance and was chosen to be the Heritage Month for our community. I think that when we talk about Asian American Pacific Islander contributions, I want to also just call out that this past year in particular has been a banner year for us, especially in the media. You think about the Oscars and Everything Everywhere All at Once, taking Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor, all of these things. We also had South Asian representation at the Oscars with Natu Natu winning Best Song. So these are just like fantastic examples of representation that we haven't seen quite as much of in the past. And I just wanted to recognize that we're in this incredible moment. But this incredible moment is also tempered by the fact that if you think back to the advent of the pandemic, particularly, and some of the anti-Asian rhetoric that has been happening as a result of that, right? We saw this huge spike in anti-Asian hate crimes that were reported in 2021 compared to 2020. That the FBI just recently reported on, saying that that spike was over 167% in increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. That is huge, right? So while we've had this like wonderful high of being represented at something as influential and far-reaching as the Oscars, we are still faced with the opposite end of that spectrum in terms of acceptance and tolerance, and feeling part of the culture and fabric of the United States. And I think there's three kinds of things that are concepts that are really driving some of this, anti-Asian sentiment that we've been experiencing, honestly, throughout our history here in the U.S. And that is the model minority myth, being seen as perpetual foreigners, and that normal racism against the Asian American community is often normalized in a lot of ways. And that's highly related to this model minority myth, right? Where we are seen as, the good, quote unquote, minority, the minority that has learned how to make it in this country and have success. And be a majority in some spaces, especially, if you look at certain industries like the technology industry is a good example of that. But I think it's important to recognize that in a lot of ways, this model minority myth works against us, actually, in the sense of, if we don't fulfill that stereotype or expectation, then how are we perceived? right? There's also a lot of internal pressure that we may put on ourselves to fulfill that sort of being put on a pedestal in some ways. And I think it's also important to recognize that in a lot of ways that myth was developed as a way to drive a wedge between Asian Americans and other minority groups in the country. And, it's, and that is, absolutely not where we want to be, right? We want to be recognized for who we are and the experiences that we've had. But we also want to recognize that we're not the only ones with these kinds of experiences. And so if we really truly want to drive more progress in DEI, we have to work in solidarity with other marginalized and underrepresented groups. So, I think really kind of doing what we can to combat this idea that we are not of this country, right? I can't tell you how many times people have asked me, where am I from, right? And I'm like, I'm American. I'm born here. I'm not from anywhere else, in the same way that you might also be from here, right? And so there's definitely this idea of that we never quite belong, this perpetual foreigner idea that is also something that we have to combat and contributes to this sort of normalization of Asian racism that has been contributing to the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, where you have country leaders referring to the COVID-19 as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, when in fact that is incredibly racially biased to refer to COVID-19 as, and so and yet there's this sense of acceptance around that, and again leading to this rise in anti-Asian sentiment that we've been experiencing most acutely in recent years. So, these are things I think are just important to point out, because while many of us have achieved some success in our Asian American professional lives, that doesn't mean that it doesn't also come with struggle, right? And I think, when I think about our community, I think about also what are the different ways that we can continue to support each other in the Asian American community. And I wanted to also just share with you a few ways that any of us can think about doing that and moving in solidarity with each other. So first is to really just get educated. The more that you can learn about the AAPI experience and our history in this country, I think the more empathetic you can become to our lived experiences, to supporting the community by buying from Asian-owned businesses and restaurants, amplifying our voices by following and sharing Asian activists, artists, and/or authors, speaking up when appropriate to advocate for the Asian community or intervene if you see that normalized racism happening in front of you, donating to organizations that are trying to stop Asian hate, or volunteering and giving of your time and energy to organizations working to support and safeguard the Asian community. These are all different ways that any of us can, take meaningful action to support what AAPI month is really all about. So I hopefully gave you a good window into AAPI month and how to think about that and potentially take action to further support it in these last couple of weeks of the month. And now I'm going to shift gears to talk a little bit about my book and take kind of a zooming out lens from that, right? So instead of focusing in on the AAPI community in particular, my book actually talks about how do you build a workplace culture of inclusion for everyone. You know, whether you are in a marginalized community, if you are underrepresented at work, and or if you're even part of the majority, right? Because the conversation, I think, to move diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging forward involves all of us. And to the extent that we can champion the needs of those from marginalized communities, it requires support from those who are in the majority and their allyship as well. So, you know, I think, you know, when we think about solving for more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organizations in which we're a part of, it's both a really simple question and a really complex one. Simple in that most people will talk about, hey, why don't you just hire more people from diverse backgrounds into your organization? But complex in that if it were really that easy, everyone would be doing it already, right? And I think that we're kind of in this zero-sum game where we're hiring people into companies from different backgrounds, but we're not able to retain them and grow them, which means that you're actually not making any progress. And this is why when we look across the landscape of DEI work over the past 20 years that I've been here, progress has felt really, really slow. And so I think if we really truly want to change this, we want to expand our focus beyond just hiring and think about this as more of a broader ecosystem around inclusion, where you're focused on helping people thrive, both from a bringing diversity in, but helping them to stay and grow inside our organizations. And that means focusing on your place, like your workplace culture, the environment. Is it accessible to people from different backgrounds and abilities? And if we think about the products and services that organizations are providing, you know, what are we developing? Who are we marketing to? Who are we serving as customers and clients in that marketplace? That has bearing on driving who actually is doing that work inside the organization, right? And then Planet is really about recognizing that none of us operates in a vacuum, that we are all part of a larger fabric of community and society. Legislative actions have impact on people inside organizations, you know, and we've seen that. We've seen that with the Roe v. Wade overturning by the Supreme Court last year. We've seen that with the Black Lives Matter movement, in addition to the Stop Asian Hate movement. So these are all things that we have to be cognizant of, their impact on people internally, as well as externally. And I think, you know, it's incumbent upon all of us to think about what role we want to play in that broader conversation. And how that feeds into all of these other areas of people, place, and product within organizations as well. And I wanted to just share a couple of examples. I think Target does a really good job of addressing all of these different aspects of inclusion in the ecosystem, where their mission is to help all families discover the joy of everyday life. They think about inclusion in their store location, product offering, hiring, behavior. It's part of their business strategy. And you can see that in terms of representation on in the makeup of their workforce, as well as their leadership team and their board of directors. The other concept that I think is really important to think about is how. Right. So if we think about those 4 P's as the what, I think about care as the how. And care is my sort of acronym that stands for courage, accountability, respect, and empowerment. And from, you know, lots of different studies and research over the years have shown how DEI contributes to business success, There's a particular study released in 2021 by Josh Burson called Elevating Equity and Diversity that cited some of the statistics that you're seeing here on the screen, where I think courage is needed because 40% of companies see DEI primarily as an issue of compliance. That's a lot of companies that see DEI really from a, if I have to do it, then I will lens, right? And that's a very limiting lens. And so we have to have courage to go beyond that and think of it again more as a part of a business strategy and imperative. We need accountability because only 1 in 5 companies actually hold themselves accountable to DEI goals, to transparency around their demographics, to self-monitoring and reporting out on how they're doing with regards to their DEI strategy. These are all things that we have to think about, having more accountability around and increasing that percentage. We have to also have respect for other lived experiences and people from different communities and different perspectives and backgrounds. Belonging is the #1 driver of employee satisfaction, according to many recent employee engagement surveys. And so if we think about having respect for other experiences, that is part of feeling connected and feeling like you belong within an organization. So it's really important that we focus on that and give people the respect that we think they deserve, as well as what we think we deserve. And then the last area of care is really E, which stands for empowerment. Of the 80 practices that were analyzed by Burson, as being most important to helping to drive an inclusive, diverse culture of belonging inside organizations, the most important was actually listening, hearing, and acting. And I think the key component there is that is the listen to act piece of that. Because a lot of times you see a lot of words in commitments to DEI inside organizations. But I think it's really important not to just have words, but to have the say-do ratio match and align as closely as possible. And so it's really important to take action on what you hear from a DEI perspective. Otherwise, you're going to get called out for not doing what you say you were going to do. And this is how we can encourage and create more empowerment, where people feel like they have a voice that is being acted on and they're being heard. Then there's a sense of, there's actually work being done, right? And I'm empowered to drive change by using my voice. And so that is really important to be able to create the right conditions in which organizations can have more people from diverse backgrounds thrive inside their walls. And another example for you all to think about, Dropbox has a very robust set of initiatives built around diversity, equity, inclusion that really kind of demonstrates these 4 principles, right? Where they created a truth and reconciliation program to educate all their employees on systemic racism in the US. They have accountability by being incredibly transparent about how they're doing against what their goals are. They deployed this incredible initiative that they called Project Maya, where they invite women and underrepresented minority talent to share what matters to them. And people who participated were actually retained at this incredibly high rate at the company. And they also have a leadership development program that is focused on development specifically for women and underrepresented minorities that are earlier in their career, because research has shown that oftentimes it's getting from that first rung from entry to the next level of careers for these groups that is often the hardest to achieve. And so focusing on people at that stage has resulted in higher promotion rates and retention rates as well. So these are all things that I think, we can all look at as great examples of potential initiatives that we might want to think about implementing within our own organizations if we want to promote more equity, equality, inclusion, and diversity of not just Asian American Pacific Islanders, but all underrepresented and marginalized groups. So all of this to say that the more intentional we are about creating diverse and inclusive experiences in our organizations, cultures, the better results that we'll actually get. It takes intention and action to lead us to results that will be different from what we've had before. So I think it's just really important to keep that in mind. And to also recognize that one size does not fit all, right? So I've shared some examples of things that you all could be thinking about doing within your own organizations to help drive more inclusion and progress from a DEI perspective. But keep in mind that you have to think about what works within your culture and organization and what you have agency to do and what your sphere of control and influence might be, because we're all at different functions and levels and, within our organizations, but we all have something that we can use, whether that's our own decision making, whether that is educating ourselves or educating others, and or whether that is actually being in a decision making role, right? So we interact with people in our everyday, and it's those interactions that can make or break whether somebody actually feels connected to you and the organization, or has like a bad experience of exclusion. And so I think keeping that in mind can help us be more empathetic and help us to think more about who are we reaching out to and how often are we reaching out to other people to create that sense of belonging. So I've given you a lot of thought and ideas. And one thing I would just really, really love is hopefully that has started your own thought processes in this area. And if there's one thing I would love to ask you to do, it is to describe one action that you will do differently or take starting tomorrow or even today to create a more diverse and inclusive culture in your organizations or workplaces. And I'd love to see it in the chat if you all have access to that and ability to do that. But know that, this is completely optional for you to do. I would encourage you to actually write it down somewhere, even if you don't make it public here, because if you do, the more likely you are to actually do it, right? And putting it to, paper, pen to paper, so to speak, or in this case, a digital signature, it gives you that accountability and a reason to follow through on that. So hopefully you all have, in your heads at least committed to doing something in this space moving forward, whether it is to, support more folks in the Asian American Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian community, or other groups within your own workplaces. My hope is that you've taken some idea away from this conversation to be able to take action to move DEI forward for all of us. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging and being here and part of this talk. If you want to learn more, you can pick up my book at anywhere that books are sold. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I'm going to make a plug for independent bookshops through IndieBound and bookshop.org. And these are all the different ways that you can reach me and follow me on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Definitely feel free to connect with me there. Send me an email to cindy@breaking.glass, or check out my website at cynthiaoyoung.com. So with that, I will stop sharing and see what questions folks might have for me.
Cindy, thank you so much for that amazing presentation and being our speaker and sharing your story. You can check the chat. You'll see a lot of people dropping comments and their thoughts. But with that said, I want to make sure that we can open up the lines of communication. If someone has a question that they'd like to ask Cindy, you can feel free to come off of mute, or you can put it in the chat and I will read it. We have about 14 minutes left or so. So I want to make sure that if you have any question about Cindy's work, the book, connections, AAPI Heritage Month, now is the time. I see there's a lot of things in the chat to go through. And Jen, yes, go ahead, Jen.
Hi, Cindy. I work in a different field than you do. I work in healthcare, and we have a lot of good amount of AAPI representation in this field. I was wondering, you work in a completely different field. What are some areas where you can see some improvement for AAPI representation?
Oh, very often, I think the place that often gets forgotten is AAPI representation in leadership roles, right? So across a lot of industries, you might see large numbers of people from AAPI backgrounds at lower levels of companies, whether that is entry. If I think about sort of technology, you often see that in, engineering. If I think about healthcare, you might often see that in like nurses and doctors. But when it comes to kind of looking at the funnel of proportional representation throughout all levels and functions of a company, that's where you see that funnel start to shrink, especially the higher up you go. Or what maybe sort of, be considered sort of non-traditional functions that Asians are tend to be funneled into, right? So I think that there's definitely areas like that we have to really think about in terms of just encouraging more folks from AAPI backgrounds to go into different fields. But to also think about, when we think about how we define what leadership is, right? What characteristics make up great leaders? I think very often they are defined by, here in the US particularly, very sort of American cultural characteristics that often run counter to things that are valued and taught in Asian cultures, right? Where I'll give you an example. Earlier in my career, I often got feedback that I was not assertive enough. And being assertive or more aggressive in communication style is something that is a much more of an extroverted kind of American definition of what leadership looks like. And my argument has always been, well, what are my outcomes any different, right? Like, are the results that I'm delivering any less than because I am more thoughtful and introverted and quiet than the next person? And if the answer is no, then don't hold that against me, right? I'm just as much of a leader as the next person who might be loud and pounding the table, but I'm just a different kind of leader. And so, those are things that we should think about really embracing and change the conversation around what leadership is here. But that's often something that is, I think, not given enough focus inside organizations, because people always think, oh, there's so much representation already that this isn't something that we need to focus on, but it really is.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great answer, Cindy. I saw Audrey's hand. Audrey, if you'd like to come off mute and ask Cindy your question.
Yeah, thank you again so much for being here. You kind of touched on this in the answer to the last question, but I'm wondering if you could sort of speak more about, finding your place in leadership and like, as an Asian American woman, as you can't see me here, but I'm also an Asian American woman trying to navigate like business and leadership spaces. Like, if you could just speak more about finding your voice in this space, sort of like going up against those barriers as an Asian American woman and handling those.
Yeah, it's interesting. The journey that I went through, and everyone's going to have a very different journey, I think as well. But like for me, I really had to, several points in my career, I really had to sort of take a step back and examine the feedback that I was getting. And I absolutely believe feedback is a gift. All feedback is valuable, both positive and constructive. Although it's, you never have to take 100% of it, but it is always good to listen for what it really means for you, right? And so when I was getting feedback that, oh, Cindy, like you need to speak up more. You're sort of invisible in the back of the room. I realized, and I used to think to myself, oh, but that's just who I am. Like, I'm an introvert. This is part of, what I've learned in life is that, the nail that sticks up is the one that gets pounded down. Right. And so I used to be like very defensive about my sort of non-assertiveness, if you will. And then what I realized was that it was holding me back, right? That defensiveness was a barrier that I had to overcome for myself, because by being that way, I wasn't being as visible as I could be. I wasn't using the voice that I had in an effective way where people actually heard me. And it was less about my intent and more about the impact or lack of impact that I was having. And when I shifted my focus to think about the impact that I was having or not having, then I realized I could ask myself the question of, all right, Cindy, if that's what people are saving, just ask, like, are you capable of that? Are you capable of doing what they're saying that you should do? And if your answer is yes, and my answer to myself was definitely yes, I am capable of being at the front of the room. I am capable of commanding a room when I walk into it. I am capable of being the leading voice at the table. Then I had to just decide to do it, right? And so that's for me, like what the journey that I went through. Because once I decided to do that, then everything opened up for me. And how you think about yourself really came through, like oftentimes it will come through in the way that you behave and act, right? If I think small, I'll act small. If I think big, I'll act big. And so once I started to think bigger about who I was and what I could do, that's when I started to get the promotions, get the leadership roles, become that VP, right? Because I wasn't sort of being that smaller voice in the back of my head. So hopefully that helps somebody here in thinking about your own journey and whatever feedback you might be getting, and what, thinking through what you might be capable of to really navigate if, that a promotion or being an executive inside a large organization is part of your aspiration. And it doesn't have to be, like, we all can have different career goals. But that's what helped me to achieve that vision that I had for myself.
Amazing answer, Cindy, of course. And I put that in the chat. I am capable is a very powerful mantra and something that each of us should say every day. It looks like we have another question from Celia. If you want to come off of mute and ask Cindy your question.
Hi, Cindy. Thank you for speaking to us. So my question was, so I heard you say that hiring, something about hiring diverse employees that it was hard to do it, or everyone would be doing it, and then it's hard to obtain the employees. And so I was just wondering, like, what was your experience on that, and what you meant? Because for me, sometimes I think like, oh, it is an easy fix. You can just hire, different backgrounds and different, people, ethnicities and everything. So I just am curious to hear your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, so definitely I can clarify that, because I think there's two components to that. One is different industries and different functions will have different sort of available pools of talent, right? So I think oftentimes when we talk about hiring for diversity, we're talking about in tech as an example, hiring people from that are from more underrepresented communities in tech. And so oftentimes that references women in engineering kinds of roles, and or Black people who are Black or Latinx backgrounds. And versus, another industry might have a completely different type of underrepresentation. But what's important is to look at, the available pools of talent compared to what you have internally. And if you have less internally than what is available, then you have that underrepresentation. And oftentimes when we target underrepresented talent, we're not targeting them in a way that makes hiring them very easy, right? So good example would be, I have been in companies that require computer science degrees, like 4-year computer science college degrees for an engineering role. And that completely excludes people who maybe went to an engineering boot camp, people who couldn't afford to go to a 4-year university and instead got a certification through a 2-year, maybe associate program. It also excludes people who may change careers, right? Who maybe have an undergraduate degree in history and decided to self-teach coding skills to themselves, right? Or people who even didn't get a high school degree, but when they were kids, they were really into coding and computers and learned on their own as well, right? So there are lots of different categories of people, and oftentimes these categories you find have higher proportions of people from those underrepresented backgrounds that are excluded from hiring criteria if you have companies that put these artificial barriers in place. And that makes hiring folks, very from different backgrounds much more difficult than it needs to be, right? So, but I find it very difficult or challenging in a lot of times to convince people that, oh, if this person comes from a very different coding background than you might have had yourself, they can be just as good, if not better, right? So it's also about changing that mindset of, oh, everyone has to have this 4-year degree. So there's there's both sides of that sort of hiring equation where change has to happen. And then, when I talk about, once you get them in, so retaining and helping them thrive is just as important, if not more so in a lot of ways, because and I'll take a completely different example. In an organization where you have a lot of customer service roles, oftentimes customer service roles are hourly paid wages, and so they tend to be roles where you can hire lots of people who come from underrepresented backgrounds, especially if you're hiring in places where there's a high pool of available talent, let's say, Houston or Dallas, Texas, or Florida, right? Where you have higher proportions of people who are in the Black community or Latinx communities. And yet, when you look at you might look at your overall representation for a company and think, oh, we've got like 25% representation from Black and Brown communities. We're doing great. But then they're all in the customer service roles at the company. And they're not in manager roles. They're not in higher level leadership executive roles. And so you're not doing what you could be doing to help grow and support them so that they can move up into other types of roles in their company. And so having a high representation is an artificial number that's inflated, right? Where you might think you're doing okay, but you're actually not, because you're not doing anything to really help those people grow and thrive and retain. And you might have this revolving door where all your underrepresented folks are just going into the same roles and leaving the company and going to a different same role at a different company and never being able to move up. So it's I think it's really important to think about the holistic picture as opposed to just, again, hiring people who kind of look and think like you or come from the same backgrounds as you, and then not doing anything to support people who may be different inside a company to really achieve what other people in the majority are able to achieve with fewer barriers.
Cindy, dropping so many gems today. Thank you so much for being here. For each and every one of you that are with us, thank you for registering and following Compass Family Services on Eventbrite. I put our next two Inclusion Talk series opportunities for Pride Month, and then in June, and then Disability Pride Month in July. You can click those links. You can follow Cindy on social. Be sure to support her work and get your copy of All Are Welcome. So excited again to have each and every one of you here. Cindy, thank you for all that you do. I hope that you had a fantastic time with us, and I hope everyone has a good day.
Oh, Rhett, I just want to say thank you to Rhett specifically and Compass Family Services for sponsoring this series of talks. It's amazing what you're putting out in the community and also what you do in the community. And Rhett, this is just a wonderful idea to bring the community together and educate folks on how to help be more inclusive and equitable and diverse within their organizations. And so huge kudos to you and Compass Family Services for all of this. So thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I'll never turn down a compliment. I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Pick up your copy of All Are Welcome. Follow Compass Family Services on YouTube. Follow us on Eventbrite. Go to our website. Follow us on all socials. Be sure to follow Cindy and get your copy of All Are Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.